right. Well, good evening. Welcome to, I guess, lecture 4. That's what we have here. And so I've passed out some notes, and of course, if you're watching through the video or online, you have access to that already. Passed out pages 14 through 27, which is probably what we'll cover. We won't get through all of that tonight, but probably tonight and in the next class is my goal to get through this material, which is going to deal with the approach to Old Testament theology and also dealing with Revelation, and we'll get through that, and then from there we'll look at the historical development. Probably spend a couple of weeks on historical development and some of the key contributors to Old Testament theology and so forth, and then we'll proceed from there. So anyway, passed out that the midterm. I passed that out. The midterm is just covering the first introductory section of the notes, which is page 1 through 13, and also the first chapter of House, which is pages 1 through 56. I think it is. It's covering that. It's got fill in the blank, and then some a few just short answer or discussion type questions related to the class notes. So anyway, that's not due until I believe it's week 8. So we have a number of weeks, but that way you have it to just be working on it at your leisure. So, all right. Well, having said all of that, let's just open with a word of prayer, and then we'll get started. Gracious Heavenly Father, we just come to you once again. We're just in awe of your just your majesty and just how awesome you are and your character. We thank you, Father, for just revealing yourself to us through events in history and through your word, giving to us your divine word that speaks to us, even though it was written thousands of years ago. Your word is still applicable, it's still powerful, it still cuts and divides and just reveals about your nature and character. We just thank you for the opportunity that we have to study it together, to look at it and try to understand some of the deep truths and the richness that it contains. Just ask, Father, that you would just guide my thoughts tonight as my teaching, and that you would just help in our understanding. Just thank you for each person that is present, and also those that are joining online. Just ask, Father, that you would just bless them in a special way, and that you would speak into their life. And we ask these things in Jesus' name. Amen. All right. Okay. Well, we've some of the, I guess as I go through this, some of the things I'll say will kind of be repetitive by the very nature of it, the way kind of it's going to work out. But that's okay. But as we've mentioned before, biblical theology, there's a number of approaches to it. It's a relatively young discipline, and there is some disagreement over approaches and how it's done, and depending on who you read and who you look at, will be done in different ways. Biblical theology, we've talked at some of the differences between it and systematic or dogmatic theology. We've kind of gets drilled down to what is distinctive about it, and some of the benefits, the practical uses, and all of those types of things. And biblical theology can look at specific sections of Scripture. I think I told you a couple of weeks ago, I had heard a message on Ruth and how difficult that was for me, and so was thinking on it for some time, and then I had an opportunity to preach. As most of you know, I'm not in a church regularly. I have another day job, I guess, and so forth. But I had an opportunity to go preach at a service, and I'd been thinking about Ruth, so I took that opportunity to preach on part of Ruth, and it's chapter 1, and not getting very far. But I was able to look at specifically in relation to this class some of the, and also considering the fact that next semester we'll look at the theological implications of Ruth. So I took the time to just kind of dive into a little bit of the theological themes and so forth of it, and found it very fascinating. So you can take, my point is, you can take an individual book, you can take a section of type of literature, you can take an author, you can take a biblical author, and you can develop a biblical theology narrowed down to in a number of different ways that you want to do it. You can look at, like, for example, the theology behind Ruth and how it fits in with it falls after the Judges and before 1 Samuel, and how it kind of fits within the scheme of things, and how the genealogy at the end ties in with the lineage of David, and so you can look at the biblical theology, and that's my point. So this class, what we're doing is we're looking kind of at the Old Testament as a whole, and then beyond that we'll look at the New Testament. So that's one way to divide it up, but it's not the only way to divide it up. But that's the way we are approaching it. As we go through the class, as we get to the individual Old Testament books, what we will do is look at the individual theological themes that are contained within the canon as we progress through. So that's kind of going to be my approach as we move through it. So looking at the Old Testament, and we're going to be following the canonical order of the Scriptures. Now, what we have to point out, I guess, first of all, is that there is a difference between the canonical order of we'll say the Christian Bible and the Jewish Bible. You'll notice if you've looked into House's book, he follows the Jewish order of the canon. So you'll notice, if you've kind of looked at that book and sort of the contents and kind of read ahead a little bit, you'll notice that he's covering the books not necessarily in order that you would be used to. It's kind of out of order. And so I felt like I needed to give some explanation with that. So when we think of the Old Testament, the very term Old Testament, when we say Old Testament, it implies that there's a New Testament, right? So when we say something's old, it just naturally implies that there's something new. And so the question that we have to kind of reconcile with is how can the Old Testament be considered normative and relevant for us today, particularly in light of the fact that there is a New Testament, right? So when we're looking at biblical theology, we have to consider the reconciliation, if you will, between the Old Testament and the New Testament has to be a part of it. Now, theology is known as the queen of the sciences, you might say, and we've talked a lot about what theology is and so forth. And it generally has the purpose of restating what God has said. But when we think of biblical theology, there has to be, as I mentioned, a reconciliation between the Old Testament and the New Testament. And so we have to kind of keep that in the back of our mind as we kind of work through these things. Now, as I mentioned, Jews and Christians share the common text. They share the Old Testament. They don't recognize the New Testament. They recognize much of the Old Testament Scriptures. However, they interpret the Hebrew Scriptures differently than we do, right? So as a Christian, when we look at the Scriptures and we look at it in light of the New Testament, we are interpreting and seeing in the Old Testament, things pointing to Christ, for example, and how it's fulfilled in the New Testament, and so forth. And the Jewish Bible is interpreted, or the Jews interpret the Bible differently, and part of that is seen in the ordering that occurs in the canon. Now, the Christian Bible, and this is in the notes, it's on page 14 and 15, and there is a couple of corrections. So if you have the note, I just handed them out. So there's a couple of corrections. I was reading over this in preparation for the class, and as generally it goes, after I print it out and waste all the ink in the paper, I notice some corrections. It's not going to be the only issues, but I generally won't point out obvious spelling errors or grammar errors that bug me, but there are a couple of things here that really just, I think, you need to correct. So if if you're looking at page 14 on the notes, there is a above where it's got the listing of the Christian Bible and the Jewish Bible. It says the Christian scriptures divide the Old Testament into 4 parts, and then you'll go down to the last sentence there, and it says the Jewish Bible includes only 3 parts, and then I've listed 4. I've listed the law, the prophets, the writings, and the prophets. Okay, well that and the prophets, the last part, you just need to scratch that out. Okay, I don't know what I got carried away there. I probably was inserting something and forgot to delete it. So I noticed that the Jewish Bible includes 3 parts: the law, the prophets, and the writings. And I don't know what that and the prophets, where that came from, so you scratch that out. And then down in the Jewish Bible, under prophets, you'll notice that Ruth is there. This is on the Jewish Bible side. You need to cross Ruth out because Ruth actually is in the writings later on. So I've got Ruth listed twice. So I thought those were a couple of key points that needed to be called your attention to. So we'll just note, we'll start off by looking at some of the differences, and I tried to lay them out side by side so we can see the similarities and the differences. And remember, in this class we're following the Jewish Bible. Now, House, in his introduction, he kind of lays out and explains his reasoning for doing it, and so forth. My reasoning is primarily. You need a,
Thank you.
No problem. I'm an accountant. I always have pens in my pockets. I don't have the pocket protector, but I always have pens. So the House follows the Jewish order, so that's the reason I'm following it. Okay, so I would call your attention to House's introduction. He gives sort of a reasoning for following that. My reasoning is because I want to follow his textbook and be consistent with him. And what he's doing. But I also want to point out sort of the differences and how it matters as far as interpretation goes. So you'll have the Christian Bible and the Jewish Bible, and for the first 5 books of the Bible, it's the same. You'll notice you have the law or you have the Pentateuch. So you've got Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Now the English Bible then, of course, goes into what we refer to as historical books, which is generally because the books are going to tell sort of a story or a history or a narrative or that kind of a thing. So we've got Joshua, Judges, Ruth, 1st, 2nd Samuel, 1st, 2nd Kings, those types of books, 1st, 2nd Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther, which all of those you can think of those as more or less a narrative in their history and that kind of a thing. But you'll notice that in the Jewish Bible, they include Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel. They go into the prophets, and they include Joshua and Judges as part of the prophets. And then they also significantly they include the 12 subdivision there of the 12 prophets, in which we would call the minor prophets, which we have at the end. Then they go into the minor prophets. So they've kind of grouped all of the prophets together, and they start with what we would think of as the some of the major prophets, Isaiah and so forth, and they've grouped it with the 12. And then they finish up by going into the writings. Okay, the Psalms, Proverbs, Job. They include within the writings. You'll notice that for us. I say us, the Christian Bible has wisdom literature, which includes Job, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon, and then we have the prophetic. And you can just kind of see the differences in the how it's kind of laid out. So for purposes of this class, what we're going to do is, after we get through the introductory matters and all of the things that we're talking about now, which will probably take about 7 or 8 lessons, is what I anticipate, lectures. Then we're going to start looking at the law, looking at Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, and then we're going to start into the prophets, following the Jewish thing. We'll look at Joshua, Judges, and my goal is to finish up with 1st and 2nd Samuel. Okay. Then next semester to pick up with Kings, and go from Kings all the way through the prophets, and then the writings, and finishing with Chronicles. Okay, now that's the goal. And as you know, anytime you have a goal, that doesn't always mean that you're going to hit it, but that's kind of where we're shooting for. Now, one of the significant differences that we see is how the Old Testament ends. Okay, the Old Testament ends in our Bible with Malachi. Now we get to the the minor prophets, and we'll of course look at these later. But the minor prophets in our Christian Bible, my understanding is that they're basically just called minor, and they're grouped together because they are the shorter prophetic books, as opposed to the major ones, which are the longer ones. That's my understanding. That's kind of how we do that. It ends with Malachi, and then of course with the Jewish Bible it ends with Chronicles. And this is, I guess, probably one of the more significant points I think that we just need to make mention of. Now, by ending with Malachi, the Christian Bible, and of course we'll look at Malachi later when we get there, but the Christian Bible emphasizes in Malachi the coming of the day of the Lord that will be preceded by the return of Elijah, of course thus kind of paving the way, opening the way to John the Baptist. And so Malachi ends with an admonition to remember the law and to look for Elijah, right? So in Malachi chapter 4, verses 4 through 12, we read, it says, remember the law of my servant Moses, the decrees and laws I gave him at Horeb for all Israel. See, I will send the prophet Elijah to you before the great and dreadful day of the Lord comes. He will turn the hearts of the parents to their children and the hearts of the children to their parents, or else I will come and strike. And I've got in my notes, there's an extra E there just in case you wanted to mark that out. But it's supposed to be a strike the land with total destruction, not the land, not like like THEE. But anyway, I don't have a proofreader, so check my stuff. So anyway, and then we have John the Baptist declared in John 1:15 through 17. I'm just showing you the connection and kind of why it's significant. And John the Baptizer declared, he who comes after me has surpassed me because he was before me. The Apostle John goes on to write, out of his fullness we have all received grace in place of grace already given, for the law was given through Moses, grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. So there is a connection between the day of the Lord and preparing for Elijah and John the Baptist, and it kind of ties together in anticipation there. Now, in contrast, the Jewish scriptures end with Chronicles, and in Chronicles, the focus, it ends with the, if you remember, it's after the Babylonian captivity, if my memory serves correctly, and it's focusing on the promise, the fulfillment of rebuilding the temple in Jerusalem, and there it ends with an edict of Cyrus. And I'm just going to read this. I've mentioned about this wonderful 4-pound Bible I purchased, right? And I was looking in Chronicles, and in the beginning it has some notes, and this is what the person writing the notes, you take it for what it is. Always say I like to look at the notes because it, but always take it with a grain of salt. It's not the Word of God. But I've heard people, pastors say, I believe the Bible is inspired all the way down to the maps. I don't know if I would say the maps are inspired, but you heard that someone say. But anyway, so the notes. But anyway, it's interesting what he says. He says this is about Chronicles. He says the chronicler repeatedly focuses on God and His covenantal faithfulness and reconciling nature. Even God's chastening has a teaching function, as well as a sanctifying function. He says, this perspective makes the tone of Chronicles didactic, almost sermonic, in its literary style and presentation. The final sentence of the chronicler's work leaves the audience with anticipation of what might happen next, and the realization that they, the chronicler's audience, are the ones who will finish the story. Thus, the chronicler ends his work with a message of the hope and possibility that comes with covenantal faithfulness. And if we look at the edict of Cyrus at the end, in 2 Chronicles chapter 36, verses 22 through 23. And again, this is how the Jewish Bible ends. We read this: "In the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, in order to fulfill the word of the Lord spoken by Jeremiah, the Lord moved the heart of Cyrus, king of Persia, to make a proclamation throughout his realm and also to put it in writing. This is what Cyrus, king of Persia, says: The Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he has appointed me to build a temple for him in Jerusalem and Judah. Any of his people among you may go up, and may the Lord their God be with them." So, in other words, the point is that the Jewish Bible ends with sort of a pointing toward a rebuilding of the temple and reestablishment of the Jewish religion, whereas Malachi points more to the coming day of the Lord, and kind of ties in with John the Baptist. So there's a little distinction in how, I guess, the ordering is kind of you can see sort of the differing interpretations between, say, from the Christian perspective in light of the New Testament, and the Jewish perspective, which does not recognize the New Testament. So I just found that to be rather interesting in that order. But that's the order we're going to follow, and I just wanted you to be able to see sort of the differences and sort of how it's divided up, and why we're kind of approaching the books out of order. We're following sort of the Jewish Bible there, and along with how House divides it up in his book. Any comments on that or thoughts? Good, interesting stuff, right? Okay. All right. Well, as I mentioned, the course is naturally divided in two parts: Old Testament and New Testament, covering the Old Testament in two parts here. Now, it's understandable that for most, I would say most Christians, most believers, feel more comfortable with the New Testament. I mean, that's where people, generally feel a little more comfortable as opposed to the Old Testament. Some of the Old Testament, the stories and things we can kind of relate to, but the New Testament is kind of where we feel a little more comfortable. Now, the New Testament, of course, has its own hermeneutical challenges, which Brother Gary is going to be covering in his hermeneutics class, I'm sure. But with the New Testament, the characters are a little, even though it is an ancient world, a little closer, a little easier, I think, to relate to in some ways than some of the, I guess, is understanding the disciples and Jesus walking on the earth in the first century is a little easier to grasp than to understand, Adam and Eve and Seth and Abraham and all of these characters that were, thousands of years ago. It's just so far removed. So the Old Testament seems to be, the ancient world, I guess, is even further removed from our ability to understand, I guess. And even at that, when we look at the historical background and the cultural background and all of that, there's more agreement, I think, and this is just my perspective, I guess. There seems to be more agreement on the cultural nuances and so forth of the first century Jew than there is on some of the cultural practices of the ancient, when you get back to Abraham and you get back to all of those characters. It seems to be that it's a little further removed. So the Old Testament brings with it, I guess, I'm saying, is some unique difficulties and challenges that we need to, I guess, try to overcome. Okay. Every year, probably in January, well-intentioned believers set out to read the Bible through. Right? I mean, it's probably every year. You got the New Year's resolution, and we're going to start off. And so many folks will start off. They pick up their Bible and they start with Genesis, right? Genesis 1:1. In the beginning, God. And okay, we're doing pretty good, moving right along. Genesis is pretty interesting with the different stories and things. But then once you get into sort of the Levitical law, Leviticus and Deuteronomy, and some of the genealogies, and you just begin to kind of bog down and just kind of and I'm just saying, I'm not making excuses, but the reality is well-intentioned believers every year probably do well starting off and then they fall off, because the Old Testament, it just seems to be that there is a with the separation of the culture and the history and all of the different things, it seems to be that it is it can be very, very difficult. And it's easier to move into more familiar passages like the Psalms and the Proverbs and the New Testament and some of the stories there. The New Testament, in particular, with the epistles and things, and the Gospels seem to have a little more application to our lives. It seems to be, as a Christian, that we can kind of apply those things easier. I know from a preaching perspective, it is difficult. It's not impossible. It's just more difficult, I think, to get really at the heart of the meaning and the contextualization of Old Testament narratives than it is to say Paul's teaching. That's not to say that Paul's teaching is easy. I'm just saying, as far as a contextualization and bringing it forward as far as application goes, it seems to be a little more difficult to contextualize and bring the meaning of the author forward from the Old Testament. Doesn't mean that it's impossible. It just means that it's more challenging than say to understand some of the be able to contextualize sort of some of the epistles and how it applies to us today. Okay, I know I simplified that, and you could probably point out passages that are difficult in the New Testament. Of course, they're there, but I just mean as far as studying a passage and then preaching it to your people on Sunday morning. Sometimes the Old Testament stories is difficult to try to, and I think pastors feel forced to try to force something that may not be there. And I think, does it make any sense what I'm saying? That you read it, you have an Old Testament story, Old Testament narrative, and you can get into the studying it, and you can study the language, you can study the culture, you can study all of those things, and all of that's good, and you can figure out kind of what the author's trying to say and what God's saying and all of that. But then to take that and then to contextualize it into our situation can be difficult. And so I think pastors either skip over those difficult parts and don't preach on them and gravitate toward what they're more comfortable with, or they try to force in their own key, as we talked before, their own key topics, or try to make it fit into something, and I think that can be problematic. So I mention all that to say I like to point out sort of the challenges, so we know what we're dealing with. Now, in his book House, I don't follow House's book, as you've probably noticed. Matter of fact, I don't think in these 3 weeks I've mentioned anything specifically in House's book other than just to read it, or I'll tell you to read it. But he does mention in there some of the difficulties in approaching the Old Testament specifically. And I want to review some of those. And this is in the book, and if you haven't read it yet, you'll read it and say, oh, that's what he was talking about. But one of the barriers is historical barriers, obviously. We are removed, the historical events, if you can think of, even if you think of your great-grandparents, right, or great-great-grandparents, and you think about, they probably spoke the same language, they probably lived in the same country, they probably lived in the same area maybe of the country, had a lot of similarities and things. But even if you were to go back, say, 150 years and try to understand culturally what your great-grandparents, how they thought and why they did what they did and all of these types of things, there would be a huge cultural barrier that you'd have to kind of to understand their perspective. Even that small example, to go back and understand why, great-grandpa did what he did or what he thought, would take some, you'd have to kind of, separate yourself from your current context, and it would be a challenge to go back and to understand that. Well, now imagine compounding that by, 3,000 years or some kind of thing. So there is this historical barrier. There's cultural settings, and of course, with your great-grandparents, there may be the same language and the same country, but now we're talking about a totally different part of the world. We're talking about a different language. We're talking about all of these differences that many of the things that we just that we cannot just take our idea of how things are and just superimpose it onto the text and say we understand it, because we won't. So there's that cultural barrier that we have to overcome. Now that is going to require the use of tools and interpretive skills and various things, but we just have to be aware that there is a challenge there. And this is one of the reasons why it's important, particularly when studying anywhere in the Bible, really, but we're speaking of the Old Testament, that when you're going to teach or preach on the Old Testament, it really takes some work to dig in and to understand what's going on in the culture and the historical setting and the literary parts and all of those different things. You can't just read it and then just, I think, Gary, you mentioned about some pastors that just read a text every day for some time and then they just pray and get up and preach. You can't do that. Unless if you want to be clear with what God's trying to say. So the matter is also compounded by the fact that you'll notice that the Old Testament is not written in a chronological order. And so when we think of a historical setting, we think of a historical book, the Old Testament is not written necessarily in the order of events. So when you're reading through it, and you go to the different books and sections and so forth, sometimes you're jumping backwards in time, sometimes you're jumping a little forward in time, sometimes you're repeating some things, sometimes there's some flashbacks. I tell you, when we watch movies, my wife always gets upset with me because I can never understand flashbacks. I get lost. We're watching a movie, and all of a sudden something's going on, and I'm like, what in the world is going on? And she says, oh, it's a flashback. Shh, be quiet, And I can't understand those things. But you have that in the Old Testament a lot. You'll have some things that are kind of repeated and so forth. I was reading just recently, in Exodus, with Moses confronting Pharaoh, and there's one place in there where it comes to the last, I think it's the 9th plague or something like that, and Pharaoh basically drives Moses out of his presence and says, that's it, I'm done with you. I'll paraphrase, okay, but I'm done with you, get out, and never see me again. And then in the very next chapter, it says, and Moses was saying to Pharaoh, thus and so, and so it seems like there's a contradiction. Wait a minute, we just said it, because Moses said, well, I'll never talk to you again. You kick me out. Now I'll see you later. And the next chapter, it seems like Moses is back talking to Pharaoh. And so what's going on here, right? And so I'm looking at it and reading the notes and so forth. And there's a key word in the Hebrew that in the next chapter that talks about him. He had spoke, like in the past tense. So it was basically a flashback, is the way it was. It was kind of flashing back to something he had said previously. But if you're reading it and you're not key on that, it looks like some contradiction or something like that. So I say all that to say that the Old Testament is not necessarily written in an exact historical order like you would a story. So there's all kinds of those kinds of things there, which leads also to literary barriers. It's not one kind of literature. It complicates it a little further, right? You've got poetry, you got prophecy, you got apocalyptic literature, you got narratives, you got all of these different genres and different types of literature which are not the same, and you can't interpret them the same. And so, these are they're written. They don't follow necessarily the Western format of writing. I know in studying sort of the epistles, for example, and the letters, it's important to understand sort of the style of writing letters of the first century. It's not like we write letters; it's a little different, And so it's important to understand sort of these forms of writing for interpretive purposes. So these are some more barriers. There's also theological barriers. that House talks about in his book. How do we reconcile some of these things? How do we reconcile, the love of God with the wrath of God? How do we reconcile a God who is a God of mercy and grace, but yet He seems to go in and annihilate entire races of people? So there's, it's not to say that these things cannot be answered or there's not an answer for them. I'm just saying that there are challenges and difficulties that we have to wrestle with when we go through and begin to encounter the Old Testament text, right? So on the first reading of it, and the critics who will read it and they'll point out some things like that. How can a loving God go in and annihilate all of these people and do all of this stuff? But when you look at it a little deeper into the theological themes and theologically understand it a little better, then some of these things begin to make sense. But not everything will make sense to us because we're finite and we can't understand all of these things. But these are some barriers that we have to overcome. So it's just important to know them. I like to, if I'm going on a journey or going somewhere, I like to kind of know some of the challenges I'm going to face, right? And I like to know that if I'm going on a trek through the woods, I like to know that I'm going to encounter a river that I may have to cross, right? I don't like to have a surprise. You're traipsing along down the path, and then all of a sudden there's a raging river, and you got to figure out how to get across it. So anyway, these are just some of those things. There's also a general unfamiliarity, and this really is a barrier too, an unfamiliarity with the Old Testament. And House points this out, and I think it's probably true that many seminary students have not read through the entire Old Testament. And that's not putting down anyone. I'm just saying that it just shows that it is a challenge because you gravitate more toward those areas where you feel more comfortable. So you read the New Testament, the Gospels and the epistles and so forth, and you'll read the Old Testament and some of the stories and maybe the Pentateuch and different things. But some of the other things, like the minor prophets, that seem to be kind of hard to understand, and some of the other areas, prophetic and the apocalyptic type literature, and Daniel and different places like that. It's just more challenging to understand. It seems kind of confusing, and so you just say, well, I'm going to, if I only got a little bit of time to read and spend time with the Lord, I'd much rather read some of the Psalms than I would try to understand what Daniel's trying to say, right? It's just kind of that kind of natural thing. And so the unfamiliarity can prove to be a barrier. All right, and I'd say even in sermon planning and sermon preparation, even pastors that preach expositorily through the Bible, through books of the Bible and so forth, will generally gravitate more toward passages of Scripture that are easier to deal with. Now, I did appreciate what Brother Gary said. I think it was a couple weeks ago, and I really appreciate this. I think it made a lot of sense. He said that sometimes you're going through and you're trying to do your exegesis on a passage, and you come to a place and you really can't understand it. You're really just struggling with it, and you said just to kind of mention it or just be honest and just move on to the next. And I think that's a good wise approach, I think. But I think what I'm talking about here is, as a pastor, you skip whole sections of the Bible and just stay focused in one area. You're always preaching out of the Gospels or something, and you because the other part just seems to be uncomfortable. And I would say it's even a good practice to try to work through something, and if you get to a point, like Brother Gary pointed out, that it's just difficult, just to be honest with your congregation and point out a few things that are obvious there and just move on, but not to just ignore it or just to just skip over it entirely. So anyway, but that's a very real barrier. It's just unfamiliarity with the Old Testament. Okay, the practices and beliefs of the Old Testament just seem weird. If I can use that word, it's just that's not really a technical word, but it just seems weird sometimes when some of the practices. Even the practice. I'll say this: I was studying book of Ruth, and what's really important to understand there is the Levitical practice, in particular of the kinsman redeemer, particularly the role of the brother when a fellow dies and he has a widow, and then the brother is responsible to come in and to basically marry his sister-in-law and to father a child to carry on the line of the dead individual, which is significant when you understand in Ruth when it says that Naomi, her husband and both of her sons died, and there was no opportunity, no way for anything to be carried on because both of her sons were dead. But even that practice seems very weird to us, you know. I mean, I have a brother-in-law, a couple of them, right? And God forbid if one of them were to die, I mean, it would just be really weird for me to go marry their wife, you know. I mean, it just doesn't even fit into our cultural understanding, you know. So even some of the practices just seem to be weird. And you know, there's a story of his name slips me, but there was a guy in the Old Testament who had that responsibility and he failed to fulfill it. Odin. And God struck him dead, right? I mean, it was a serious thing, right? And I mean, that just seems weird, you know, to us. And so these are just some areas. But now, having said that, the Old Testament needs to stand on its own, and it has something to offer, right? And so we have to understand it. The Old Testament is a part of the Bible, documents the history of religion of Israel, of course, but the Old Testament outlines and develops the development of Israel's history. And some parts of the text seem to be more significant to the church than others. However, and an individual by the name of Rutledge, and this is in the notes, but he points out in his work on Old Testament theology, I thought this was good enough to include in my notes here. He says, if we attach value and significance to the Old Testament only when it agrees with the New Testament, or only when it fits in with modern social values, then we are denying it any real authority of its own. You know, and think about that. If we said, well, the Old Testament is only valuable when it agrees with something in the New Testament, or it agrees with my moral values, or what my perspective, then what we're really doing is we're really denying it having any authority on its own. We're saying, well, it's only authoritative if we can see where it agrees in the New Testament, or if it agrees with our understanding. And so we've run into a danger there. So we have to understand the Old Testament, even though it seems to be in places difficult to understand, it still has authority on its own. And I think this is one of the challenges with biblical theology, particularly with the Old Testament, is, and I think I've got this later in my notes somewhere, so I may run back across it, but it's like someone pointed out in one of the books I was reading. I get confused who I was reading, but anyway, they pointed out that the Old Testament for us as Christians is a lot like reading a book through the second time. We know the ending, right? So we kind of know the New Testament. So when we read the Old Testament, we're reading it in light of what we know the New Testament says. So it's difficult for us to separate and to approach the Old Testament on its own authority. And so, you know, as we mentioned before, with biblical theology, of looking at the theology up to that particular point, you know, what would Abraham have understood? What would Moses have understood? What was the author trying to communicate? You know, and even when I'll just use this example because it's just fresh on my mind with the book of Ruth. It ends with a genealogy and ties in, and sort of the climax of the story is that Ruth had a son. I believe his name was Obed. And it says that Obed was the father of Jesse, who was the father of David. And then it gives a genealogy that traces from Perez, the son of Judah, traces all the way to Jesse and then to David. Okay, and that's where the author stops. Now, from our New Testament perspective, we naturally understand of Matthew's chapter 1 genealogy, which includes Rahab, includes Boaz, includes Jesse and David, and also traces it to who? Traces it to Jesus, right? So we understand that line doesn't stop at David, but it points to Christ. And so my point is, when we come to an Old Testament book, we have to remember that the author, in that case, did not understand the full fulfillment of it in Jesus Christ in the New Testament, did not have Matthew's Gospel, didn't understand that, and so we have to take it from where it is and understand it on its own authority, and that's my point. So that's but it's difficult. It's easier to say that than to do that, because when we read it, we actually understand, oh, David was, an ancestor of Jesus, and we naturally tie those things together as we should. But when we're looking at the Old Testament, specifically with biblical theology, we have to take the Old Testament on its own and its own authority and see what the Old Testament has to offer. Okay, so there's a tension in the Old Testament between descriptive and prescriptive faith. Okay, in the Old Testament, descriptive meaning that the Old Testament gives an account of what the Israelites believed about God and how those beliefs developed. Right, we see that. We can see how it's descriptive of the Israelites and how they came to know God, and we'll talk a little bit probably next week of Revelation and how God progressively reveals Himself and gives some examples of that. So there's the descriptive side of it, but there's also the prescriptive side. This is the faith is applicable for Christians in the present. So the Old Testament has something to say to us. So we have to be careful when we approach it, because we can easily approach the study of the Old Testament as just a descriptive idea, where the Old Testament is just describing the events of the Israelites and how the Israelites came to know God and what the Israelites thought and all of those types of things, almost like you were just reading a history book. But there's also the prescriptive element, which is for our faith and speaks to us today. Okay, so John Goldingay, and he's the professor of Old Testament at Fuller Theological Seminary. He said this: any Old Testament theology worthy of the name must bring both the descriptive and the prescriptive or normative together. The task of Old Testament theology is to mediate between the religion of the Old Testament and the religion we believe and practice today. Okay, so what he's basically saying is that any Old Testament theology that's worth anything is going to connect the descriptive element of what actually occurred with the prescriptive element of what does God want us to do with it. What are we supposed to do today in our life? How is it to define our faith? And so, this is a key aspect that we have to keep in mind. All these things we've got to kind of balance. Now, it's not an easy task, but it's just this is what some of the challenges and things that we face when we're looking at Old Testament theology. Okay, John Bright is a former professor of Hebrew and Old Testament interpretation at Union Theological Seminary, and he was there until 1995. And he stated the thought sort of this way. He said, the Bible is at one and the same time the religious literature and the historical record of an ancient people. And it is the normative canonical document of the faith of Israel and of the Christian community which regarded itself as the true heir of Israel. Viewed as the first, that's the religious literature, viewed as religious literature, it contains many things that belong to the ancient situation and cannot in any direct way serve as a model for Christians today. Okay, I guess you'd use the example of, if my brother-in-law, God forbid, were to die, I'm not going to run up and go marry his wife. Okay, I mean, just take that as an example, right? So there's some things like that. Viewed as the second, which is the historical record, it is a primary record of the faith which we claim as our own, and as such remains the court of final appeal in all discussions regarding the nature of that faith. Basically saying the same thing, that the Old Testament must have a prescriptive element to it to define our faith and to speak to us today. So when we approach the Old Testament, it's not just as an ancient document to tell us about how the Israelites thought about God and so forth, but rather it also has a defining element for ourselves. We need to approach it understanding that God wants to speak to us today in the authority that comes from the Old Testament as it speaks on its own. So, so there are challenges, but it needs to be prescriptive as well. It has something to say. So the tension between the past and the present is really what we're kind of dealing with, right? So we've got this ancient document with all of these old things that seem kind of weird to us, but yet there is the present, and there has to be there's this tension between it as we read it, right? So there are elements of it that are going to be difficult to understand, elements of it that are going to require us to to give some prayer, some thought to, but ultimately it's not just about finding out what the Israelites believed about God, but rather it's finding out what God, of course, did how He revealed Himself in history, but also what is He revealing about Himself to us today. So anyway, Rutledge in his book, it's another book I was kind of relying on, he said this, and I'm using some quotes because I think it's, particularly when I'm trying to explain something that is, I think, important. I'm just using some quotes to show I'm not off the deep end here. This one of the benefits of commentary, I think, Brother Gary, I keep referring to you, but I think you mentioned not all these things are overlapping in the courses. But with the commentaries, you look at them after you've done your study and due diligence to see if you've kind of gone off the rails, to see if there's something you have not considered, and so forth. So it just kind of gives sort of a confirmation, I think. If you study the Scripture, do your work, and you come to some understanding, and then you go to the commentaries, and all of these commentaries are just saying the exact opposite, and you probably need to just kind of go back and reevaluate and say, hey, did I miss something? Or if on the other side, if they kind of confirm what you have kind of discovered, then you can feel kind of confident in saying, well, I still could be wrong, but it seems like these other guys agree with me. And so it gives you a little bit of confidence there. So anyway, Rutledge, he says this. He says, it is more than, speaking of the Old Testament, it is more than a record of developing religious ideas and traditions, or a series of narratives through which narrators seek to present testimony and counter-testimony of what they perceive as the truth, and which then becomes the reality. It is and I underline this part, it is a revelation of the truth about the nature and being of the living God, and about His dealings with His people and His world. As such, it contains permanently valid truth that claims authority over us. And I think that's just a good way to say it, that there is an element where there is religious traditions and ideas and narratives and all of these things, but it's revealing how God, the living God, dealt with His people, dealt with the world, and how He has truth that is permanently has authority over us. And so that's a part that we have to just keep in mind. Okay, so the as I mentioned before, there is agreement among conservative theologians that the study of the Old Testament is an important component of overall biblical theology, and we need to study it and so forth. Biblical theology being important. But there is there's not really a consensus on the approach or the method. How are we going to go about it, right, in the Old Testament theology? And so we want to look at what is the starting point. Where do we begin when we're approaching this topic? And this is, I guess, one of the areas, just to be honest, that I've struggled with, and I guess still struggle with, in studying for this and preparing and teaching, is where exactly do you begin, right? I mean, if you are starting, if you say, well, I'm going to teach on a book of the Bible or something, well, if you're going to teach on Genesis, for example, where do you start? You don't start Genesis chapter 16. You start Genesis chapter 1, right? Verse 1, you start there, and then you work your way through it. With biblical theology, there is a little disagreement, or I don't say disagreement, but different approaches, that's a better way to say it, for a starting point. So where do we begin? Okay, I want to talk about some of those areas, and then kind of lead into kind of where we're going to begin. Not that it's necessarily the right place, but just kind of give you some idea. So you could just start with...
Can I make a comment about...
You can make
I'm going back to something that you were talking about earlier, a couple
Right.
things.
Go ahead.
About all the barriers.
Yep.
And I know in the study of hermeneutics that a lot of times some of the books call them gaps, these gaps, but I listed some others that I thought are really significant. And I just wanted to mention them, I'm not going to teach the class. There's a geographical barrier. You know, we don't live there with people riding camels. We have BMWs, and
Right.
but people still ride camels in some of those places.
Right.
You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
There's cultural barriers, there's dress and customs, and they had no technology. You know, my grandkids have no idea what one of those phones is where you
Right.
did the circle thing. I mean, they don't know what it is. And even something like World War II has been taken out of the textbooks, you know, so that they don't even know that there's a Vietnam War or a World War, II. And I wrote down that there are linguistic and language barriers, which I think was probably what you had as literary barriers. And one that has really just, I don't even know how to say it, but it's like a supernatural barrier where they really got to see the hand of God in an amazing way, say like at the Red Sea or
Cloud.
with the flood, huh?
The cloud or the pillar of
That's
fire.
right, the pillar of cloud by day and the pillar of fire by night. And we can't, you know, for us, it's just like the dividing of the Red Sea. We've seen miracles and stuff, but nothing like that. I mean, and it's hard.
Right.
If you take all these other barriers and the chronological barriers and
Miraculous type of things.
it's just, it makes it even more, really more difficult. And so the reason I'm saying all that is because you made a statement, and you said this is really the tension between the past and the present. And all of those barriers, I mean, that was really a great statement, how that really is the tension, that we don't understand what life was like. You know, most Americans have never been to a third world country. If they've never been to a third world country where they don't have nice homes and running water and refrigerators and washing machines and dryers and Mercedes-Benz and Lexus.
We don't know what it's like to go for a couple days without taking a bath, or
Yeah, I mean, we ran into that in Romania just this past week, in that most of the guys don't, I say most of them, but they don't change clothes every day. And the reason they don't is because they don't have washing machines at their homes, and so they wind up wearing clothes, you know, and some places, we were talking about it yesterday, I think, at church, in that in certain areas like in Thailand or Vietnam or other places, India, we were talking about India, how they still go down to the river to take baths, to wash their clothes, and to do other things there, you know, and that's where they get their drinking water. For us, it's just like we cannot even relate to that in the 21st century. And then if you added 4,000 years on it,
Right.
it'd be even worse. So I didn't mean to.
No, that's a good point. I kind of skipped through some of that, but yeah, I think that brings out what, you know, so I say there's a tension between, you know, what's going on there and understanding some of the things. You know, it's we can't really appreciate some of the stuff and some of the things in the Old Testament. You know, when it talks about a famine, for example, and people having to move because of a famine or find food, or even when you think of when Joseph went off to Egypt, and his family, there was a famine in the land, and everyone, all those types of things. I mean, we complain when the grocery store doesn't have bread on the particular day that we walk in to go get bread. I was complaining the other day. I went to Bilo, and I was going to get some hot dogs. And I went and got the hot dogs, and then I went over to get the hot dog buns. They didn't have any hot dog buns. All they had was wheat bread. And I was like, wheat bread. I can't stand wheat bread. And no hot dog buns. And my daughter was with me. She said, "What about these?" It was 1 pack of hot dog buns, but it was like the whole wheat hot dog buns, I said, "No, I'd just rather eat without a bun, So anyway, but I was complaining, my problem, I had to eat a hot dog and didn't have a bun, to put it on, right? And so we have huge problems in our.
Even if you took the idea of the kinsman redeemer, I'm not exactly sure this is all correct, but probably shouldn't say anything, but there was involved in that because they wanted to be able to propagate that guy's seed so that he didn't lose his land. The land was, everything revolved around the land that he owned, and he needed a son, and it was even, they even did some of that kind of stuff when a husband died and they had never had any sons.
Right, exactly. Yeah, to understand, for example, that, and we're just going back because it's kind of fresh on my mind, but to understand that and other biblical passages, you have to understand some of those things. And if you don't understand it, you just kind of read through it, and it makes no sense. Or either that, or you miss the whole point of what the author is trying to say. There's that whole instance. You're right. The kinsman redeemer had a responsibility for the land, and interestingly enough, in that, and of course, one of the reasons I like the Book of Ruth, I'll just say one reason I like it is because in the Book of Ruth, God does not speak anywhere. There are no miraculous events. There's only 2 places where He indirectly acts, and that's at the beginning where Naomi recognizes that the Lord had visited Judah and provided food, and then later on in chapter 4 when it says the Lord enabled Ruth to conceive and have a son. But other than that, the Lord's not mentioned, and the Lord's kind of hidden. And that's one of the reasons I like it, because it's that's how we kind of understand God, right? I mean, we don't really see the miraculous events, the parting of the Red Sea and all these things. We kind of go through life and wonder sometimes, well, is God even here? God, hey, we're down here somewhere. And but what we don't realize is that God is sovereignly working behind the scenes and sovereignly in control, because He's obviously present through that whole book. It's very clear. You just don't see Him in an outward way. So, and so the kinsman redeemer is important because of the land, because of the inheritance. There were some other responsibilities that the kinsman redeemer was to have, and of course, there's a little plot twist in that book in Ruth. Just thinking about it, where there happens to be another individual who's a little closer relation, but he doesn't want to fulfill it, because it says in the passage that because he doesn't want to, how does it say it? I'm going to use a word, I know it's not the one in there, but he doesn't want to jeopardize his inheritance, his land and so forth. The idea being that if he was to father a child through Ruth, then his own children would be detrimentally affected because of the way the land would be divided and so forth. So there's that whole thing in there that involves the land, involves all this stuff, but it's a cultural thing, right? And so the audience, who was writing the story, they would have understood, most likely, what was being said and what the implications were. We, however, 4,000 years later, are looking at this thing, and we have to kind of do some digging to kind of to get at it. So there is that. And it doesn't mean it's impossible, but it just means that these are some things we just have to be aware of as we approach it, right? Okay, good thoughts there. Appreciate it. The starting point, the Old Testament. We could start with the Old Testament itself, okay, and we could examine how the theology of the Old Testament kind of developed and progressed. Okay, that's kind of one way we can do it. We can just look at the Old Testament, start there. The potential problem with this is that we end up focusing perhaps on just the historical process, get tied up in how things developed in history and all of that, at the expense of theology and conclusions and so forth. Because in other words, we don't want to treat the Old Testament as just we're looking at it from a historical standpoint and want to know what happened, and how things developed. We want to know the theological, we mentioned before, I think, the implication behind the text, right? The theological implication. So it's starting with the Old Testament sometimes. So if we don't have some of the other understandings of Scripture, we can just treat the Old Testament as a historical document telling a story, and we can kind of miss some of the other implications. So there's just starting with the Old Testament is it's not saying it's the wrong way to do it. I'm just saying it does have a hidden danger or obstacle there. We could start with the New Testament. Some would take this approach, seeing what the New Testament authors had to say about the Old Testament, because the New Testament authors, this was their Bible. This is what they used. They quoted it quite a bit, right? So there's a lot to be said about that. However, and to start here, sort of puts the, I think one of the authors I was reading said it this way, is to kind of put the cart before the horse. In other words, to an understanding of the theology of the Old Testament is necessary for really understanding and interpreting the message of the New Testament. Right? So if you don't understand the Old Testament and some of the things that are going on there, it's difficult to understand the New Testament, right? Because you got to kind of understand how we got there. So when you get to the New Testament, you have to kind of understand the Old Testament, right, to understand how we got there. So if you start with the New Testament, you have a danger of, as I mentioned before, of coming to the Old Testament with the sort of the New Testament thought superimposed onto the Old Testament. So you're kind of interpreting the Old Testament with the New Testament in mind, which we may say, well, that's what we want to do. But from the Old Testament theology's perspective, what we're trying to do, biblical theology, what we're trying to do is let the Old Testament speak for itself first, to understand what the Old Testament had to say. And if you start with the New Testament, then you're kind of, and also I'll say this, it's not to say that they were wrong, but if I can say this correctly, but in some of the New Testament instances where they use the Old Testament to make a point, whether it be, Paul in Romans chapter 9, where he refers back to some Old Testament passages about God choosing whom he'll place mercy on and so forth. If you take those texts, Paul is using the Old Testament, or the New Testament is using the Old Testament to make his point in the New Testament. But that point would not have been something that would have been understood by the Old Testament author at that time in that context to his audience. Does that make any kind of sense of what I'm trying to say? That if we start with the New Testament and take how the New Testament authors used passages from the Old Testament, of course they're correct. I'm not going to debate with Paul, right? But when we're looking at the Old Testament and wanting the Old Testament to stand on its own, we want to be careful that we don't just take something that we understand that's revealed to us later through the Apostle Paul and take it back and put it back here and say, well, this is what Moses must have understood, or something like that. Does it make sense what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. So you kind of want to be careful starting in the New Testament. So these are just some of the challenges, So we could, some have suggested we start with Jesus. It's a good place to start, right? Who's going to argue with that? Who's going to argue with that? Jesus, on the road to Emmaus, his disciples, Luke chapter 24, verse 27. Jesus approaches the disciples. He said to them, how foolish you are and how slow to believe all that the prophets have spoken. Did not the Messiah have to suffer these things and then enter his glory? And beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he explained to them what was said in all the scriptures concerning himself. Okay, so we could start and see what did Jesus have to say about the Old Testament, right? So that may sound like a good point. Of course, focusing on the words of Christ, should be our, I guess, a valid goal. However, okay, I hate to say there's maybe a problem with focusing on what Jesus said. That doesn't sound so good. But if we do that, we run the risk of approaching the Old Testament through a Christological lens, of viewing things, from a Christological perspective. And we have to remember that in the Old Testament, they did not know about Jesus. Did not understand these things. They didn't understand what was going to happen and so forth. So if we approach the text, the Old Testament, the other danger is there's some that believe that, well, every Old Testament text points to Jesus, and that's not necessarily true, and that's not what Jesus was saying here. There's a footnote that Rutledge, in his book, and it's in my footnotes, it's in my stuff, but he makes this in a footnote. Okay, I like to read the footnotes sometimes, and he says this in Luke 24:27. Jesus is not suggesting, as is sometimes claimed, that we can find direct references to him in every Old Testament text. Rather, he sets his ministry, and in particular his suffering and death, in the context of a divine purpose being worked out through the pages of the Old Testament that finds its ultimate fulfillment in him. Okay? So he's pointing to a divine purpose being worked out and through the Old Testament that finds fulfillment in himself. But it's not to say that if we were to randomly open the Old Testament and stick our finger down and pick up some verse, that verse is necessarily pointing to Jesus, right? I mean, does that make sense what I'm trying to say? So it's not necessarily the answer to say, well, we'll just see what Jesus had to say about the Old Testament, and we'll do our Old Testament theology that way, because we miss some things there.
Would it be a fair statement just to say, and maybe you said this, that the starting point of the Old Testament is that you never even mentioned the New Testament?
Yeah, I mean it's a when we go to the I think and again there's this is where it gets down to where different theologians approach it different ways. Okay, so I'm not going to say I got the answer because I don't, but I think it's fair to say that the temptation or the tendency is going to be to approach the Old Testament with the New Testament in mind, because we understand we're approaching it from that perspective. But
you said we've read the end of the book.
We've read the end.
We know that ends.
Yeah. So I think that's just a natural way. So when we read the Old Testament, we're thinking in terms of how does this point to Jesus? How is this fulfilled in Jesus? So. But when we're looking at Old Testament theology, we want to know what does the Old Testament say for itself, and how is God progressively revealing himself at this stage in the Revelation. Then we can't rely on the New Testament to give us that necessarily that I don't want to just make a blanket statement we can't rely on the New Testament, but I think you understand what I mean. If you're looking at Moses or Abraham or Samuel or any of these other Old Testament writers or Solomon or any of these folks who did not have a knowledge or understanding of Christ, or the church or any of these things out here that we have, that we can't then take what, necessarily what Paul said and superimpose it back and say, well, that must be what Solomon meant, or something to that effect, or that must be what Samuel was saying, and to read it in that way. So I think that's accurate, that you can't rely on the New Testament, because you have to. And that's not to say that later on in your contextualization that these things from the New Testament that we understand and we see how it fits in don't come into play. But for our purposes of understanding the theology of the Old Testament and how God's revelation progressively developed and how God progressively revealed Himself and what He's saying to us through His Old Testament on its own, then yes, we have to approach it kind of separated even from sort of Jesus' explanation and fulfillment. Because remember, Jesus, even when He was explaining the Old Testament to the individuals on the road to Emmaus, this was something new. This was something that they did not understand at that point until Jesus explained it to them, right? And so if the disciples didn't understand it and Jesus had to explain it to them, then certainly the Old Testament prophets would not have understood those things. Now, that's why the Bible is such a rich and wonderful revelation of God, because God understood all of it, and so He used individuals to, through inspiration and all this, to write what He wanted, and it all fits together beautifully. But the authors would not have necessarily understood those things. So we can't really approach it from that standpoint as well. Luther wrote this. Oh, the other thing I was going to say is that if we do that, if we take what Jesus said and we go back and try to superimpose it on the text, what we run into is the tendency to spiritualize and allegorize some parts to make them fit. So we're going to go back and kind of see some things that aren't necessarily there. We're going to allegorize or some parts of the Old Testament. Luther wrote this. Luther said, "It was very difficult for me to break away from my habitual zeal for allegory. Okay? And yet I was aware that allegories were empty speculations and the froth, as it were, of the Holy Scriptures. It is the historical sense alone which supplies the true and sound doctrine." Okay, so we even see Luther struggling with this, right? That there was a tendency for him to allegorize Scriptures. But he recognized that was, as he says, the froth, right? I guess the whipped cream on top or something. But it's the historical sense that supplies the true and sound doctrine. So getting back to that historical sense, I think, is our goal there. Okay. There's another potential, and I think I'm going to get through this. I may stop. We'll see where we are, because I'm going to get ready to start into another section, and I'm thinking that I don't want to get started into that. But what about the church fathers, right? You think about some of the church theologians, right? Luther, Calvin, and Zwingli, or you pick them, whoever, right? Perhaps we can start there in studying the Old Testament theology, biblical theology. They certainly had plenty to say about the Old Testament, right? The Old Testament, the church fathers, key theologians, and different individuals in history. So we could start there and look at that. However, there's some difficulties with this as well. Because biblical theology is a relatively new discipline, as we'll see later. It's only 200 or 300 years old, I guess, and in the scheme of things, that's relatively new. It really kind of, I guess, most people trace it. It can be traced. We're going to trace it back a little further, but most people trace it back to about 1787 with a speech that was done by a guy by the name of Gabler. They trace it back to there, but it can actually be traced back a little further, I think. But nevertheless, that's only a few hundred years, right? And so that's after Luther, it's after Calvin, it's after these guys, right? So there's a little difficulty there. But they certainly did have a lot to say about the Old Testament, and they talked about theology. They may not have put it in the format of a biblical theology or something like that. But the problem we have with that is that, first of all, these giants of the faith did not put their biblical theology into a format for us to follow. and very few of them actually put all of their theological works into one set of volumes, right? Like Calvin produced, with the Institutes of Christian Religion, that's what it's called, right? So he put all his kind of theology, I don't know about all of it, but a lot of it in there. But Luther, from my understanding, never really produced you correct me if I'm wrong here, brother, but I don't think Luther ever produced one work, where you go to, Luther's book. And Luther had a lot of writings, but they're all in different places. And this is why, when you follow the Lutheran tradition, the Reformed track kind of tied back, I guess, to Calvin and looked to his Institutes of Religion and some other documents and different things. When you go to Luther, they didn't really have that, so they had to get together and argue on different things, and they came up with different creeds and statements and so forth that the Lutheran Church kind of relies upon, that summarizes some of Luther's thoughts. But there's not one work, is my point, right? I mean, there's not a thing we can go back and say, well, this is Luther's 5-volume set on his theology, right? It's all over the place. So if we were to do do that approach, it would be a lot of digging, a lot of work to try to figure out what all of these church fathers had to say about the theology of, say, the Old Testament. So, because it's not in one work. If you're going to look at, systematic or dogmatic theology, you can go and you can kind of see where Luther wrote on a particular doctrine or something. You can look at Calvin and see what he wrote about it. You can look at others and see what they wrote about those topics. This is before the biblical theology, because they lived, several hundred years before that. And so, but it would just be a difficult task, is what I'm saying, to approach it from that standpoint of let's look at what all of these church fathers had to say. Okay, so what does all of that mean for us today? Okay, what I've covered is just some of the challenges, I think, that we have to deal with when we're approaching the Old Testament theology. It's not an easy thing to do, because, as I mentioned, it's very tempting, it's very easy to drag with us our cultural understanding, our theological framework, our understanding of the New Testament and revelation that has since been revealed. It's easy to take all of this stuff, even our denominational understanding and things, and to come back to the text and to superimpose it onto the text and say, well, this is what the author must have meant, this is the theology, and so forth. And that is what we have to avoid if we're going to approach the Old Testament and look at specifically the theology. Okay, as I mentioned before in this course, we're not approaching it like it's not a survey of Old Testament course. We're not looking at. We're not going to get too much into who wrote it and timelines and all of these types of things. And issues, we're looking more in the development of theology, and specifically the development of revelation. Okay, it's how God progressively reveals Himself. Now, these are some of the questions and some of the things that I kind of struggled with how to approach it. Now, I'm going to be honest with you. I don't have the answer yet. I'm hoping, prayerfully, that by the time I finish this course about next May, if you were to ask me, I might be able to have my own thoughts on what is the correct approach. I generally, what I'm doing, I would generally say some of these approaches have value in and of themselves, but they cannot be relied upon exclusively. Like, for example, it would be beneficial to see if some of the church fathers, Luther and so forth, had something to say about Old Testament, progressive revelation and these types of things, would add to it. But I don't think it's an either-or proposition. From our standpoint, the way we're going to approach it is sort of the same way House does, which is a canonical approach, which we're going to look at the books as they're in the canon and see how the theological themes are developed within those settings and so forth. Now, that's not to say it's the only way, or even that it's the best way. It's just, I think, a good way. Okay, does it make any sense what I'm saying there? So, but those are some of the challenges. Now, I'd hoped to get into the area of Revelation. And when I say Revelation, I don't mean the book of Revelation. I mean as far as how God, the divine revelation, revealed Himself. And that's my next section. But I only have about 7 minutes, I think. 7 or 8 minutes or something like that. I don't know what time I'll let y'all have, but I think something like that, maybe 10 minutes. I don't know if I want to get into this because I don't think I can do it much justice here. Let me ask you this: do you have any thoughts or anything over what we have just discussed? Anything? I know it seems like, and I know I kind of see this myself. It seems like, well, let's just hurry up and get into the books and let's get in there and start looking at some stuff. And I promise you, we will. I just think that it's important to kind of cover, because once we get into looking at the books, we're going to be in there for the rest of this semester and then all of next semester. And I'm really thinking it's just a good idea to cover some of the basis, particularly since this particular topic is not real familiar to everyone. And so if you're watching online or you're here, biblical theology is sort of a different it's a different discipline, and so it takes a different mindset. I think we almost have to kind of adjust our mindset before we even we kind of get in there, because otherwise you're looking at it from a different lens. And so so we want to look at it in the proper way so that we can kind of understand these things. And it is important, but as I mentioned before, it's something that is not to exclude other disciplines like systematic theology or dogmatic theology or anything like that. But it is helpful in understanding some of these things. So, any thoughts or anything? If not, I may just stop a few minutes early rather than dive into the next section.
I think, Caleb, that one of the things that makes the biblical theology of the Old Testament so difficult is that we don't spend any time in the Old Testament. Mm-hmm. I mean, how do you spend, how many chapters does Isaiah have? What, 66 or something? Like, I mean, how do you cover 66 chapters? It takes me years to cover 3 or 4. But and it's different, because it's a historical narrative, but it also has incredible doctrinal areas related to God, and there's a theology of God in Isaiah that's probably the pinnacle of that. And but the average pastor, me included, I just don't spend time in the Old Testament teaching out of it. I use it for examples,
right?
But not for a teaching venue, other than you might teach a book like Daniel, or you could teach a book, a similar book. People go through the Jonahs, and because it's 4 chapters. Mm-hmm. But these big book, who teaches 2nd Chronicles? Mm-hmm. And so what I'm saying is that we really lack a familiarity with the Old Testament, other than the root stories, the creation, the Red Sea, right, the flood, those kind of things. David and Goliath, and Daniel in the lion's den, and all the kids know those stories. Mm-hmm. In fact, we spend more time in the Old Testament with the children
Right.
than we do in the New Testament.
Right.
And I think there's a reason for that, but I think that makes biblical theology even more difficult, because we just don't, in the 21st century, have a real interest in the Old Testament.
Yeah.
You know.
I think that's true. I mean, what you're saying is that, it is. I mean, if you had a choice on, say, I'm going to preach a series of messages on the parables in the New Testament, or I'm going to preach through Chronicles, I mean, it's just, you got to preach the parables. It doesn't mean that the parables don't have their own hermeneutical challenges and different things, but you can talk about, the prodigal son and the 99 sheep and the one, and all that, and people can kind of, it's keep their attention. But when you get into, some of the other things, it's difficult. But it doesn't mean that they don't have value. It just means that it's a little more difficult, challenging. We're not as familiar with it. We're not as comfortable with it, and things like that. And I think this is hopefully this course will challenge us, hopefully. And of course, even in 2 semesters, we're not going to be able to do justice to some of these, things. I mean, we could spend 2 semesters just teaching through Isaiah, that kind of thing. But so we're not going to do justice necessarily to it. But hopefully, we'll see some of the things that will give us a little more perspective on some of the aspects of God's character as He reveals Himself. One of the things I found, and I guess I'm rambling. I'm gonna use up all my time anyway. But one of the things I find interesting is that God, there's so much about God. God is, you can't even fathom, God. Just think about that for a moment. But He self-reveals things about Himself, but only those things that have to do with a relationship with us, according to His redemptive plan, and things that we need to know about Him. But He doesn't reveal necessarily everything about Himself. He can't. But it's just amazing looking at what He does reveal. All right, let's close in a quick word of prayer, and then we'll be dismissed. Heavenly Father, we just once again thank You so much for being so far beyond our comprehension. If we could understand You, You wouldn't be worthy of our worship and praise. And we just thank You that we are just humbled. We're just humbled in Your midst, or just in Your presence, and just looking at these things. Lord, I just pray, Father, that You would help us as we continue to study, and when we begin to look at Your Word more specifically, that You would just give to us understanding as we try to understand Your revelation. You progressively revealed Your character to us, and what You have to say for us. And Lord, I just pray for each person, just to keep them safe as they go about their business this week, and we ask these things in Jesus' name.